If your job at a healthcare facility includes disinfecting against viruses, you know prevention is the best medicine. And maintaining healthy spaces starts with a healthy cleaning routine. Grainger's world-class supply chain helps ensure you have the quality products you need when you need them. From disinfectants and cleaning supplies to personal protective equipment, so you can help deliver a clean bill of health. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
On this episode of Booked on Rock, Queen's groundbreaking album A Night at the Opera turns 50. How it would change the course of the band's future. The tape disaster that almost was with the song Bohemian Rhapsody. The album track that almost led to a lawsuit, and more coming up next.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to the latest episode of Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Gillian Gaar is back on the podcast. She's the author of Queen and A Night at the Opera 50 Years, part of Motorbook's excellent album series. Welcome back, Gillian. Good to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
A Night at the Opera. Boy, that's the album that changed everything for Queen, huh?
Yeah. I mean, before then they were promising, and then afterwards, boom.
And you write, quote, before its release, they were promising. Afterward, they had finally arrived. So if you could set the scene for us, where is Queen at as they head into recording this album, which is late summer of 1975? At this point, they'd released 3 studio albums. What's interesting, though, is the band seemed to be in a fearless, no barriers mindset going in. Is there pressure from the label to come up with a hit?
Well, I think they probably felt more pressure than the label did. Back in those days, really, you look at some big acts, and they would put out a couple albums before they really had a big one. And it's not like today, or that really started changing maybe more in the 90s and after that, especially this century, where if your first album didn't make it, then bam, you were dropped. But in the old days, they gave you time to develop. And yeah, they'd had 3 albums out and had done moderately well. They'd begun headlining their own tours in Britain and had toured the US, not yet a headliner, but they'd had a hit in the US, Killer Queen. That's the first song I remember hearing. You know, good solid hit. But still, it's just one hit. And what were they going to do on the next album? And I know Brian said they felt that it was just make or break time. So I think that's what made them especially fearless with this album, because yeah, they really did have nothing to lose. Brian had even said that he thought if they didn't have a big hit with this one, the band might well have broken up eventually.
Crazy to think. Yeah, the lineup is Freddie Mercury on lead vocals, Brian May on guitar and vocals, Roger Taylor on drums and vocals, and we have John Deacon on bass. The producer, Roy Thomas Baker, who's so important, and we'll talk about him in just a sec. But let's start with the extensive rehearsals. They were intense, but also seemed like the guys were having a good time. According to the book, Freddie was a great tennis player. I found that out about him. Where were those held?
I think it's Rockfield up in Wales, a place that catered to bands that needed a place to rehearse away from, like a large city environment where there might be too many distractions and temptations. Here you were in the countryside, and, they had a lot of amenities there. They had a swimming pool. I looked online, and there was this Japanese magazine that was there at the time to interview and take pictures of Queen. And you see, there are so many pictures of those, the time they spent there, you can find online now, just this bucolic setting. And sometimes they're wearing, like the tight trousers and everything, even though they're amongst the shrubs and flowers. So that's an interesting dichotomy too. But because you usually see them in an urban environment, don't you? Pictures of them. It was always like a studio setting or the urban environment. This album, I mean, it was such a complex album that the rehearsals were very beneficial, because they did spend a lot of time in the studio anyway. But if you're not well rehearsed, then you have to spend even more time. This
was a former farm, right? Converted into a studio?
Yes, exactly. So it had, the various outbuildings that the owners just refurbished so that people could live there or rehearse there and that sort of thing.
And you write that the band's ingenuity in the studio was taken to a new level on this album. So talk about how ambitious the band was and how having a very open-minded Roy Thomas Baker was also a big factor.
They were really lucky in finding someone like Roy, who they'd worked with before. And on Queen 2, Queen was interested in stretching the boundaries of the studio as well. And they told him, working on Queen 2, that if there's any trick you wanted to try that other bands wouldn't let you do, try it with us. So they were a good match in that way. They wanted to push things and their producer as well. So I think that was well, obviously that benefited them tremendously. Roy did this extensive interview with Sound on Sound that really got into the kind of technical details. And I think he's mainly talking about the song Bohemian Rhapsody, but of course it gets into the album as a whole. And he seemed to feel that he and the band hadn't really got sufficient credit for how innovative it was technologically, aside from the quality of the music and the songs, what they were like, but just all the things they had to do technically. That he said we had to create. There wasn't, a switch you could hit and get that sound. Like one thing I learned, I was fascinated to learn this, that the wind sound at the beginning of the Prophet song, today you'd, I don't know, maybe get a note on a synthesizer or something and distort it to how you want it. It was the sound of an air conditioner that they recorded. And yet it sounds, just like the wind blowing off the high mountaintop. So that kind of thing, it just showed an attention to such detail. And then reading how Brian or even John, they would put their instruments, they would record, say, a guitar part, but record it 3 different ways, either plugged directly into the amp or plugged into the console, and then mix all these together. Just things people wouldn't necessarily think of, but just how they took it down to the nth degree, that kind of detail.
Also, you got 4 guys, all 4 of them can write songs. That's all this. I think it's the only band ever to have each individual member with a #1 single, whether it's a #1 on, mainstream or rock charts or whatever. But it's amazing. Yeah. The talent in that band. The title of the album, there are a few stories behind what inspired it. What are the stories behind that? A Night at the Opera.
I've always read the most common one, that they were at one of the studios and relaxing in the evening and watching a Marx Brothers film. So they thought of it that way. But there's a couple of magazines that have come out in Britain. All good Queen fans might have it. The Ultimate Music Guide to Queen. And it contains a lot of reprints of articles that ran in the British music press from New Musical Express and Melody Maker. You're not necessarily going to find all that stuff online. I don't know if those sites really have archives. I suppose if you search, you could find them. But anyway, so these would have articles that came out at the time. And I found if you look at an interview that happened closer to the incident, then you're likely to get a more accurate version of that story because it's fresher in their memory, and people's memories change over the years, though you don't realize it. So in one of these interviews, Freddie he gave a completely different explanation and said it came at the end of recording. He and Roger were talking, and he just thought Night at the Opera because the album just had these operatic elements, and he thought that was a good theatrical title.
Let's get into the tracks now. The lead track, Death on Two Legs, written by Freddie. The most vicious lyrics I ever wrote, is what Freddie said. And but he never mentioned who it was about in interviews. Who is he attacking? And also there was a lawsuit that was filed by this person.
A threatened lawsuit, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know that they ever quite filed it, but he was attacking Norman Sheffield and I guess the Sheffield brothers in general, who were their former management, and they also ran Trident Studios. And they were, doing management and recording, and it was too much of a conflict of interest that came to a head eventually. And Freddie felt they weren't paying them properly. Norman himself wrote a book later, which is worth seeking out if you're interested in that subject, called Life on Two Legs, twisting the title of the song about him, in which he talks about Queen and the fuss between them. But Trident recorded many, many well-known artists too, the Beatles and David Bowie and so many others. So it's about the history of Trident Studios and how he started it and kept it running. And boy, is that a job. But so this was a thinly veiled attack on Norman Sheffield. And they threatened legal action. But Norman didn't really want to go through with it because he didn't want to hold the band up that much, even though they had their problems. He still didn't want to hurt them that much. So they came to an agreement, and the album came out, and Sheffield continued getting a share of the albums until whatever the terms of the contract were. So, he got some financial compensation. And I think that's why subsequently Freddie never said anything, just to avoid any legal action. He never mentions any names. Maybe kind of dropped some hints. I think he might have said something to do with business, but he doesn't say his name. And I think, he'd probably been warned, this matter is settled. We want the album to come out. We don't want legal trouble in the future. Just don't say his name. So, he actually kind of had fun doing that, like teasing people by not
Yeah. Oh,
saying
yeah. Freddie because I remember the scene in the movie where they're in that office of one of the record exec or record label guys, and they're playing Bohemian Rhapsody for him. And Mike Myers is the actor who's playing that part, and he's talking about how nobody's going to want to listen to. Are they referring to him? Is that scene about him? I think
they may have been someone at EMI rather than
right.
Trident.
Okay.
Because EMI was the record company, and they were definitely resistant. Well, it wasn't a long song. The Beatles got away with it. So did Richard Harris with MacArthur Park. But
even Elton John, you quote him in the book. He's the one who was saying,
"Oh yeah,
this isn't going to
ridiculous.
This isn't going to work."
All the thematic changes were just too much for people as well. It was one thing to the other, and kind of abruptly, really.
Track 2 is "Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon," also written by Freddie. And now here's where we get some experimentation here in the studio. Freddie's vocals. Can you describe how they're able to get? I guess it's a megaphone effect, right? They use a bucket.
Yeah, he's recording, and they sent the signal into a microphone and a bucket, and then it was picked up in there. Or, the speaker in the bucket and a microphone picked it up, and so you got that echoey sound. So there's an example of something they had to create instead of just, let's get echoey megaphone sound. Click, flipping a switch. No, they did it. They did it the old-fashioned way.
Time consuming, right? Especially back in those days.
When you edited a song, that was one reason why they wouldn't necessarily do overdubs, because you couldn't remove, say, a bad note. Might be more beneficial to leave it in. And when you cut tape, you literally cut the tape, slice and splice it back together.
I'm in Love with My Car, written and sung by Roger Taylor. We mentioned using actual sounds. That's Roger's car?
Yep, just recorded as it was revving away. I was just talking to someone who he didn't like that song at all. He thought it was a dumb song. I think it's kind of a fun song.
Yeah.
I said I liked it better than Sweet Lady.
Yeah, that's Roger's signature song.
Yeah, it's funny that, it is kind of, it is a ridiculous song in a way, but he just plays it absolutely straight throughout. And so that's actually what makes it kind of great, I think.
Yeah, and he said the unusual 6/8 times signature, that's one that he had a great time playing. Now we get to John Deacon. He's got the next song. He wrote "You're My Best Friend," one of Queen's most popular songs, and he wrote it about his wife, Veronica. He married her early in 1975. But you say that referring to the partner as best friend broadened its scope, giving it a touch of innocence. So that's a big factor, I would think, in it becoming a hit.
Yeah, I think more people can relate to it because you're not just talking about a romantic partner. You could be.
Could be a pet. It could be,
your parents.
Sure.
A pet. I hadn't thought of that.
It could be. Well, Freddie he had those pets. He loved his cats. And
cats.
Yeah. Delilah and what was the other one on Innuendo?
He would name a cat Delilah.
Yeah, Bijou. Delilah and Bijou were the ones he sung about on Innuendo. But do you think, so John Deacon, is he at this point now, he's kind of coming to his own as a songwriter, because he wrote, if I'm correct, part of a song on the last album, or
It was a complete song. It wasn't very long. It's only about 2 minutes or so. Misfire.
Okay, Misfire, that's right.
And sweet, which I liked it. Nice kind of pop song. But yeah, it is pretty short. So, I don't know if he was trying to write other songs and not coming up with anything, or if this was literally his second song. Still, it's early on in his songwriting, and to come up with something like that is, pretty impressive.
Sure, it's just another weapon that in their arsenal that they can use. They had a formula from this point on, I believe now. So you'd get Freddie and Brian would get the bulk of the songs that would end up on the album, but then John Deacon would get one and Roger would get one. That'd be kind of a standard as they went into each album.
Yeah, pretty much. I think Roger began writing more. And then in the last two, The Miracle and Innuendo, they just had joint songwriting credits, which Brian said solved a lot of problems. And he wished they'd done that earlier.
But I think it also speaks to the sound of Queen is so varied. And it's because you got all four guys. John Deacon did Another One Bites the Dust, came up with that bass line.
Yes, he didn't write many, but a lot of them that he pulled out were winners.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I'm going to need some pliers and a set of 30-weight ball bearings.
What?
If Fred gets here before I'm back, you can tell him to start without me.
What the hell you need ball bearings for?
Oh, come on, guys. It's so simple. Maybe you need a refresher course. Hey, it's all ball bearings nowadays.
Now, here's probably one of my favorite deep tracks from Queen. The next track is titled 39, written and sung by Brian May. And you write, quote, 39 is a seemingly upbeat sailing song with an unexpected twist that you might not notice if you're not listening carefully. This is like a Rod Serling Twilight Zone story. What is this song about?
That's a good comparison. I have to remember that. It's talking about a voyage. So you think, oh, a sea voyage. It even sounds kind of, almost like a folk song from the past. So that sort of enhances the sea voyage element. But then when you listen more closely in the remaining verses, you see it's a space voyage. That's why the seas are milky seas. I guess an ocean can be milky at times, but you don't normally think of it that way. But these are milky seas, and about a group of explorers going off to find a new planet to colonize and getting caught in the time warp thing that supposedly happens, where the further away you are in space, time is progressing at a normal rate for you, but on Earth, it's going at a faster level. So when you come back, you've been away 5 years, but everyone's aged 10 years. That's not the exact formula.
Something like that.
Like happened in Planet of the Apes.
Yes. Brian gets the next song titled Sweet Lady. This is the one track that had its share of critics. Weakest song on the album, but you say still worth listening to, especially the way it ends.
There's some other songs like that too. Like I think of Hello Goodbye by the Beatles after the main song ends, and they have that kind of fade out and they're singing sort of a different upbeat type of thing. And Queen did something similar here, I think, where, it's more a straight ahead rock song, but then they double or triple the tempo and at the end, which is a lot of fun to listen to.
Yeah. And if you're a fan of Brian May, you just love to hear him play. It's worth listening to just for that. And I am going to ask you about that guitar. That's a great story too, because you have some sidebars throughout the book we'll get to. Side one finishes with Freddie Mercury's Seaside Rendezvous. Talk about the instrumental break, which you say is the song's most remarkable element.
During the instrumental break, a horn section comes in, except it's not being played by horns. It's everybody's voices. Freddie and Rogers, I can't remember if Brian participates, but they emulate the sounds of Roger does a pretty good trumpet, as you can hear. And they're not just blowing on, paper and comb or kazoos or whatever. They're doing it with their voices, which Roger said they did something like that on Bring Back That Leroy Brown from the previous album, the third Queen album, Sheer Heart Attack. Yeah. He said that, we like doing things like that. Again, their own vocals, not really getting into hijinks or auto-tune or, we'll distort it this way. That was them doing it themselves. I love that song. I think after Bohemian Rhapsody, Seaside Rendezvous, and Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon are the songs I play the most, because I love that campy musical vaudeville side of Queen a lot. That was Freddie's specialty, of course.
I was going to say very Freddie. Very Freddie. Queen and a Night at the Opera 50 Years is the name of the new book from Motor Books, and the author is Gillian Gaar, and some cool sidebars. So let's get to this. Sidebars throughout the book, including one on Brian May's red special guitar. And you say it in the book, a guitar unlike any other in the world. Tell us the story behind this meticulous creation by Brian.
I'm not sure when I first heard about this. It was some years. It was some years before I knew that Brian was playing a completely homemade guitar, which, is not easy to make. His dad knew about electronics and would often just repair stuff at home or make things at home. Brian claimed that his father made a rudimentary television. So Brian wanted an electric guitar and he couldn't afford one. So they decided, well, we'll just build one. So they used things they could find around the house, like the mantelpiece from a fireplace, cutting the wood out, places where there were holes in the wood. He would break matchsticks, wooden matchsticks, and use the matchstick to fill the holes. For the whammy bar, it was a bicycle bag, I think, the bag that you would hang on your bicycle. And for the stopper on that, I think he used the knitting needle, the cap of a knitting needle from his mother's sewing basket. They wanted to make it out of kind of found things. And I think pretty much the only things he bought were the pickups, because you're not going to be able to make your own pickups really, or I suppose you could, but that would be even more difficult. But just the different types of wood and putting it together, and he could still use it. So, that hands-on craftsmanship really says something.
Now, like he says here, we had no idea how big a part the red would play in my life. I thought I'd just have fun with it at home. Yeah, he started it in August of 63, finished it in October of 64, and then the name comes from its reddish-brown color. He refers it to as Old Lady, too, as he also calls it.
And he plays it with a sixpenny piece.
Yeah.
And he didn't like a pick. And Brian, even, being ever so meticulous about this stuff, was saying that I think the older sixpenny pieces, which would probably be a type of pence coin these days, that they had more nickel in them. So they were a bit softer, and the serrated edge would help him get different tones from the guitar. So he always has a stack of older sixpenny pieces he can rely on.
He says
I think he said people mail them to him as well.
Really? Yeah, he says sixpences are very soft metal, which doesn't hurt the guitar strings. But if I turn that serrated edge at an angle to the string, I can get that kind of articulating, percussive consonant sound. I call it graunch. He calls it graunch. Yeah, before about 1950, they had a high content of nickel, which makes them really soft. So I especially like a 1947 sixpence, the year that I was born. There you go, folks. Find a 1947 sixpence and send it to Brian.
For his birthday.
Yeah. All right, let's flip the album over and drop the needle on side 2. The opening track is The Prophet Song, written by Brian May. Queen's longest song, 8 minutes, 21 seconds. And this is your bold statement of the book. If not for Bohemian Rhapsody, this, you say, would likely be the album's cornerstone track. And I agree. The song is a warning, a prophecy of doom if humanity doesn't change its ways. Talk about what you say is... Talk about what you say is one of Freddie's most extraordinary vocal performances, and why, if you're going to listen to this, put some headphones on.
I think it's interesting, and I don't know that I've read this, but I've wondered why Brian didn't sing it himself. He did write songs that Freddie would sing, but he would write songs that he would sing too. And that's an interesting question. What made him decide which songs were for him and which were for Freddie? But perhaps with this one, with the vocal section in the middle, I mean, that would have to be Freddie, because Brian doesn't have that kind of a voice. But what he did was have Freddie sing kind of what they term a canon, where you start the phrase, you maybe did this in school, they called it a round, like group A would start singing the phrase, and then the next group would come in partway through, and it would sort of create a harmonizing effect. And that's what Freddie did, but with his voice. And I guess when they were recording it, they would have tape strung all the way around the room as it was being recorded, just to get those delays, and so that he could sing with his accompanying vocal. And because there's 3, they have it on each in the center. You hear him sing in the center, and then his vocal will be on one side, and then his vocal will be on the other. And I haven't heard this, but later there was a 5.1 surround sound release of this album. And Brian said that was the effect he really wanted. When you hear Prophet Song in that setup.
Okay. Yeah.
That version, and with that speaker setup to where they're kind of all around you. I don't have one of those. So
no, I don't either. But yeah, I can imagine him saying that, and that's something that he wanted to do with it. And then the blowing wind of the Prophet Song, that takes us into Love of My Life, which is written by Freddie. And that blowing wind, that's the air conditioner, right?
Yeah.
That's what, yeah. It takes us into Love of My Life, written by Freddie. We hear the harp on this, played by Brian. Freddie's classical influence comes through here. And now talk about Freddie as a piano player, because he didn't think much of himself on the piano, but that's crazy because I think he does a great job. But I guess if you're a serious classical music fan, you set the bar very high.
Yeah. Well, as you say, he did not have as much faith in his ability on the piano. So in Queen's later years, they'd bring in other people to play keyboards. And I think you miss his own warmth when he's playing himself. So I wish someone could have made him see that, although I'm not sure how many piano bass numbers there were in the 80s. I'm really a 70s Queen fan. I'm not that much of an 80s Queen person. But yeah, you can see the classical influence clearly. And maybe being so interested in classical music, he realized his playing is fine. It's perfectly suitable for these numbers that he's doing. But maybe being interested in classical music, he realizes how much better other people are. But he didn't have to be at the level of a concert pianist. What he did was fine for the work they were doing, for the ballads.
Side 2, track 3, Good Company. Another track from the album that conjures up an early musical era. It opens with the sounds of the vintage jazz band, written and sung by Brian May. You quote him talking about how this song was written by a then 28-year-old, but fits in with the Brian of today. What did he have to say about where his mind was in 1975 when he wrote this song?
I actually was able to ask him about this. I did an interview with him for Goldmine about the Starfleet side project that he did. So, you understand most of the questions are going to be about Starfleet. Perhaps other journalists would then go into the Queen questions, but I just, stuck to the main thing. But then I got this one in of my own. I did want to ask about it because I thought it was so interesting. It's really a depressing song if you listen to it, but it has this jolly, upbeat melody. And, this man at the end of his life is looking back at his life and thinking, oh, what was it all worth? And it just seemed a strange thing for a young man to write when, he's still in his 20s and would have most of his life ahead of him. And so where did that downward mood come from? And he said he was just projecting and imagining himself in the future and what would that be like and what would you look back on and think about opportunities taken, opportunities missed, that sort of thing. But his songs, a lot of his songs always had kind of a melancholy side to them. I mean, 39, obviously we've mentioned that. And some of his other songs too, in the future, he was thoughtful. And there was this extraordinary quote from him in, I guess it was in Mojo. I don't think it was in Mark Blake's biography. Is This the Real Life? Which is a really good Queen biography, by the way. But he was talking to Mojo and he just said how being in Queen screwed us all up. And I'd never really heard a big star say that. And he said, yes, it was very damaging to us in some ways. And of course, that is the kind of a remark Brian would make, being very thoughtful and thinking about it. Not that he regretted having big success. He just, he's saying it's not all great. There is this other aspect to it. Well, he said with his marriages, their marriages, most of them, well, John Deacon was the only one whose marriage lasted of the three of them.
But then when Freddie died, his marriage was on the rocks.
I remember hearing about that. So this is, like years later. That might have not even, I don't know if that was even last century. That might have been this century.
Yeah.
I remember hearing something about that he'd pretty much retired after, Freddie died and they had the big tribute concert. And he did like one or two other things and was on the last songs that he worked on a final song with them. But then after that, he pretty much just retired, didn't do his own stuff, just cut things off completely. And even Brian and Roger didn't seem to see him, but they accepted that. They said, well, that's just what he wants to do. And
Sure.
He did have a large family by then. I think, 5 or 6 kids. But then, I did hear something about how, he went through this period where he left his wife, though they didn't divorce, and he was seeing someone else, but then it sounded like they got back together. The thing is, because he's not in the news very much and he never gives interviews, I'm still not really sure what happened.
Right.
What he's doing now. He's
very
really
private.
He's
very
the Greta
private.
Garbo of Queen. He just wants to be left alone.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
It's intermission time.
All right, so the next track is one that people have probably heard of, Bohemian Rhapsody. So many great stories behind the making of this track, which is epic. The roots date back to Freddie's days at art college at one point, and this is all in Gillian's book. People can read this and so much more. But at one point, it was titled Mongolian Rhapsody. I want to zero in on the most time-consuming part of this, which is the opera section. Now, it took about 3 weeks to record this, which was the average time spent on an entire album back then, according to Roy Thomas Baker. How were they able to put all this together? And could you talk about, they did so many overdubs that they almost lost the tape, right?
Yeah. Well, it was Freddie's baby, and it really came together because they had faith in Freddie. And the song has its different sections, and each section has its different sections. And Freddie had it in his head, and he would write it down. And I think it was Brian who said that, it just looked like a bunch of buses being drawn. He knew where all the pieces fit, and no one else really did. And if you can imagine just hearing the parts separately on their own and not having any idea how it's going to sound put together, you think, how is this going to come out? Be like filming a movie when you when you're filming the last scene first, and you're
Right.
just given
Yep.
a script for that scene and have no idea what the rest of the story is. But they had faith in him and just let him get on with it. And the opera section was initially only going to be about 30 seconds, but he kept adding to it. I think Roy says every day he'd come in and say, "Oh, just a few more Galileos here."
Yeah.
So it ends up being about a minute. Julie Webb, a journalist for the NME, said that she was there watching them doing some of the vocal overdubs and saying something like, if they sang Galileo once, they sang it 120 times. Just, she just saw them doing it over and over and over again to get the right part. They were indeed overdubbing so much that the tape, because they're working on tape, it's not digital, started to wear away. And Brian said you could hold it up to the light and sort of see light coming through it. So they very quickly had to transfer it so that all this work wouldn't get rubbed off. I think it was Roy who said, there was some loss of sound. You get that much on there, and you can't hear everything that clearly. So he felt every time they added something, you would see a bit of a loss. But overall, it sounds fine. I mean, when they heard it complete, everyone was just stunned at what this sounded like, as you could imagine, hearing it after all that work.
Yeah, some of the imperfections ended up in that final version, right? Some of the harmonies were a little dissident. I don't know if I'd ever be able to pick up on it.
Yeah, that's the thing. I was listening to was an NPR interview with, I think it's Nigel Godrich, who produced Paul McCartney's Chaos and Creation. And there's a song where he's just kind of vamping on piano and he hit a wrong note. And then after the take, he says to Godrich, "Well, we have to do that again because, I played that wrong note." And the producer's going, "No, it'll be fine." Kind of adds to the atmosphere, the humanness. Sure. And so they're playing it. And then I don't know if I could recognize it again, but they play it and they, point out, this is where the wrong note was. And, I hadn't noticed at all. And I'm sure no one else did. Yeah, you probably couldn't pick out the faulty harmony on Bohemian Rhapsody either with all that, unless someone pointed out to you, "Oh, it's right here at this mark." Then maybe you'd recognize it again and again. But the average listener, no, I don't think so.
And there was a video for Bohemian Rhapsody, and there's another sidebar in the book, and it's on this part on the making of videos. They weren't known as videos. They were called promotional films at the time. How far back does Queen go with videos? I mean, are they among the first to make them?
Well, I guess it depends on when you consider videos starting, because there have always been short promotional clips of a song that a musician or performer is performing. I mean, that goes back to the 30s, like be a short subject when you saw a movie in the movie theater. That was like the forerunner of that kind of thing. Oh, I always loved, there were machines called Scopitones. They were like jukeboxes, and you put money in, you could see a little, we'd call it a video now, play in the 60s. These really campy, kitschy things. You could do a search for, Scopitones and see what you come up with. But really, I think when television got going in the 60s, you think of bands like the Beatles and others doing what were called promotional films because they were shot on film, where they'd be performing, and sometimes it would just be a straight performance, and then maybe they'd start doing other things to make it look more interesting as a means of having something to send out so the band could appear on all the different variety shows they had without having to go and appear on all these shows, which would be in different countries too, and so on. So Queen was in on that from the beginning, from their first album. You can see that on YouTube. And some of the DVD releases they put out, they put DVDs of their videos. You can see these kind of early efforts. The ones for the first film are pretty much just straightforward performance videos, as is Bohemian Rhapsody, really. I mean, it doesn't really have a lot of special effects. It's pretty, some of them are kind of rudimentary, like when I forget what the term is, but you see Freddie's face and then you see all the ones expand behind it. That's about the most elaborate it gets. They have those sequences where you just have the tight headshots of the band. And then the others are just scenes of them performing. They were rehearsing for their upcoming tour, and so they just shot some footage for that too. So yeah, it's really pretty simple. And in a lot of ways, I think the simpler videos come off best.
And a perfect ending to the album with God Save the Queen. That was used to bring the concerts to a close.
Yeah, because they did that in Britain. I don't know if they still do, but when you went to the theater, they would play a recording of God Save the Queen afterwards. And I guess, I don't know if I saw many rock shows that did that, but certainly theatrical performances. So it would make sense to hear that at the end of a theatrical production like A Night at the Opera. which I know when I first heard the album, when it was released, I wouldn't have been aware of that they played Britain's national anthem at the end of theater shows. So I suppose I just thought, oh, I guess they just threw that on there.
And when it was released in late 75, number 1 in the UK, 4 in the US, Bohemian Rhapsody, number 1 in the UK, top 10 in the US. You know, My Best Friend was top 10 in the UK, top 20 in the US. Roger Taylor quoted in the book as saying, it's the most important album the band ever made. So here's my question, Jillian. They had some great albums that followed. And you cover them in the book, by the way, so people should know that too. You cover the band's career after the album in this book as well. But is it by far Queen's best? I mean, because there are some albums after this that are pretty close. Where do you rank this?
Well, I personally would rank it as number 1 myself.
Yeah.
But it'd be interesting to talk to some fans that like the later career more than I do to see how they would rank that. I mean,
because the next 3-4 albums were huge, you know?
Yeah. Well, that really, that kicked him into the upper stratosphere. I don't know that I like them all as much as a complete album, though. Certainly not as much as Night at the Opera. My favorites are Night at the Opera, Sheer Heart Attack, and Queen 2. Though most especially side black of Queen 2. That's my favorite.
Oh, that's cool.
That one, I probably play that as much as Night at the Opera.
Jazz? What about jazz? You're a fan of jazz?
I played side 1 a lot. A lot of times I'll just sort of fixate on one side of an album for whatever reason, or those are the songs I like better. I really like side 1, and I was never as keen on side 2. I think it's probably Queen's most eclectic album, really, jazz is. I love the beginning, Mustafa, Freddie's
right.
Kind of nod to his roots.
But look at the run they went on, though. After A Night at the Opera, A Day at the Races, 1976, News of the World, 1977, Jazz, 78, The Game, 1980, Flash Gordon, and then it starts to get mixed results, and you get into the 80s. But what a run, you know?
Yeah, that's pretty strong. You've got some good solid songs there too. In retrospect, I think Day at the Races was sort of just a paler copy of Night at the Opera. I think News of the World was another one where I mostly played side 1, interestingly enough. In the 80s, I thought they just got too big and bombastic for my tastes. And when Innuendo came out, I remember thinking, oh, this is like Queen of the 70s.
Oh, absolutely.
I like that one. But then, especially the first number, Innuendo.
When I first heard that, heard it on the radio, when I was in college. And this is Queen, you know? Yeah. But I remember the DJs at the time. Yeah, well, the DJs at the time were talking like, I hear something's going on with Freddie, and this is, we're hearing something about the songs on this album have to do with it. And I remember that so well because, that was pre-internet, so you didn't know things right away.
Speaking of video, I love the video of I'm Going Slightly Mad from that album.
Yes, that's the one. Isn't that where he's wearing like the fruit on his head or?
Yeah. And whiteface. And I read later they had him in whiteface to sort of disguise how much his illness had progressed. But it was also fitting for him. I mean, it was perfectly in character. So I didn't think anything of it when he's in whiteface. You're like, of course he'd be in whiteface. It's Freddie. Yeah, he still had that. Remember the way he bit the banana?
Yes.
The banana got tight.
But just to see him in that condition. And he went to that studio and he tore into it with the vocals. Like Brian May said, sometimes he'd have to take a seat and take a little drink of, whiskey or whatever it was, and he said, all right, let's get back in there. And that I admire so much about him is that he wanted to get as much music in as he could before it was his time to go. And boy, what a body of work. Yeah. Queen and A Night at the Opera, 50 Years is the name of the new book from Motor Books. Is it out now? What's the release date?
Well, technically, the pub date is tomorrow, April 1st. So by the time this airs, it will be out.
It will be out because we're recording this on March 31. So look for it to wherever you get your books or your nearest bookstore. You can always go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest bookstore. And where can people find you online, Gillian?
I think it's just at Gillian Gaar on Twitter, because I still call it Twitter. On Facebook, I have, I guess you'd call it a fan page. I'll say a business page. That sounds more professional. And that's Gillian Gaar Writer. And that's just, like an open page that you can like and choose to follow. It's not one where you submit a personal page where you submit a friend request. So that's
Yeah.
where I will post, well, like the link to this. I'll be
Yep.
posting to this on there. And reviews or stories I've written.
Gillian Gaar, thanks so much, and we look forward to having you back on again in the future.
Yes. Okay, great.
That's it. It's in the books.